The story opens with a reference to the spirit of healing, a mythical being known for its ability to connect with all things in the world and perform miracles. It is said to possess immense beauty and power, which is why humans revere it as a goddess. Someone reflects that, given such a legendary reputation, the spirit of healing must also be capable of curing his creature, Catless. It becomes clear that this creature is a dragon, gazing intently at a glowing circle that begins to form. He calls upon the spirit of healing, invoking the name of the great Lord of Time, and demands that it reveal itself. He adds that if granted the power he seeks, he is prepared to offer a worthy price in return. With urgency, he implores the spirit to respond and appear at once. As the summoning ritual reaches completion, a young man is seen lying on a bed, stunned and confused by what is happening. The man and the dragon exchange bewildered glances. The dragon, puzzled by human standards of beauty, remarks on how surprised he is that the one who appeared is just an ordinary human. Nevertheless, he concludes that appearance is irrelevant compared to ability and urges the spirit of healing, now revealed to be the young man, to grant him its power. The young man, overwhelmed, internally wonders if he has finally died. We are introduced to him as Kim Ohjin, a 32-year-old veterinarian who spent 2 years in pre-veterinary studies and 4 more in veterinary school. At one point, a professor scolds him for dozing off in class and wakes him up sharply. After earning his license, he worked for 3 years as a veterinarian with meager pay. One day, a man visits his clinic asking for help with his pet, admitting he can't afford the costs. Ohjin, saddened, explains that the clinic is not an animal shelter. Eventually, Ohjin opens his own practice, naming it Kim Ohjin's Pet Clinic, though it is in such poor condition that he hasn't even fixed the broken clinic sign. The clinic sits empty, and he appears disheartened by his overall circumstances. His struggles grow worse with mounting rent and loan interest, leading him to thoughts of death, until one night he hears a strange, disturbing noise while sleeping. He then wakes up in a strange cave, face to face with a massive dragon, and instantly realizes he has been summoned to another world. He wonders whether he died of a heart attack in his sleep, and is now in this surreal situation. The scene around him feels like a version of hell he had once imagined. A freezing cave filled with gold and jewels, a terrifying creature, and a summoning ritual that resembled black magic, all while still in debt. In confusion, Ohjin asks the dragon what is expected of him now, to which the dragon calmly replies that all he needs to do is heal his pet. Ohjin imagines the pet must be terrifying, perhaps like a 3-headed beast guarding the gates of hell. But the dragon gently asks Ohjin to treat his beloved child, and as the dragon moves, dust can be seen gathering on his scales. From beneath one of the dragon's wings, the pet finally appears. It is a small fruit bat named Catless, with a withdrawn personality. Ohjin stares at the bat in disbelief, wondering if it really is just a bat. The dragon then asks what Ohjin thinks, if the creature looks cute to him, while Ohjin remains visibly unsettled by the whole situation. He quickly notices that the bat looks extremely weak and drained of energy. Switching instinctively into veterinarian mode, Ohjin begins asking professional questions about the animal's name, how long it has been raised, and when the symptoms first started appearing. The dragon responds that the bat's name is Catless, and that he has been caring for it for about a week. He adds that raising bats has recently become quite trendy, and we see a gathering of dragons proudly showing off their pet bats. The dragons chat among themselves joyfully, expressing pride in their unusual pets. The dragon explains to Ohjin that he chose to raise a bat because it seemed popular and fun, and he happened to find this little one stuck near the entrance of a cave, so he decided to keep it. This deeply frustrates Ohjin, as he despises pet owners who adopt animals merely because they've become fashionable. Ohjin asked the dragon about the bat's condition, and the dragon explained that it had not been eating properly or consuming much at all. He added that he hunted fresh creatures daily and offered the bat their blood, yet the bat refused to go near it. The dragon had assumed that, like himself, the bat simply had refined tastes. Ohjin moved closer to the bat to examine it more thoroughly. He grew increasingly irritated by what he heard, recalling unpleasant memories of people who raised animals without knowing the first thing about them. The dragon then innocently asked whether the bat was suffering from a serious illness or merely needed higher quality blood. Ohjin snapped, clearly agitated, and explained that this was a fruit bat, a species that could never consume blood. The dragon was taken aback. He mentioned that other dragons had told him they fed blood to their bats, prompting Ohjin to erupt in frustration, emphasizing that there are various species of bats. The one in question was not a vampire bat, but one that feeds solely on fruit. Ohjin continued scolding the dragon, pointing out that he had unknowingly starved the creature due to his ignorance, and the dragon, embarrassed, admitted that this was his first time raising a bat. Ohjin then criticized the cave's extremely low temperature, stating that the bat was practically entering hibernation from the cold. The dragon replied that he was an ice dragon and unable to create a warmer environment. The constant reprimanding left the dragon mentally drained. He wondered if the legendary spirit of healing always possessed such intensity. Ohjin went on to denounce the idea of keeping animals simply because it had become trendy, questioning whether pets were now treated like accessories. The dragon realized he had no adequate response and deeply regretted his actions. Looking down at the bat with a heavy heart, he acknowledged that, despite its small size, it was a living being, and he had a responsibility to care for it. Quietly, the dragon approached Ohjin and stood behind him while Ohjin remained still, lost in reflection. When Ohjin turned around, he saw the dragon gently cradling the bat with great tenderness. The dragon softly apologized to the bat, admitting that its suffering had been the result of his selfishness and ignorance. He promised to bring fresh fruits immediately and vowed to return the bat to the place where he had first found it. The dragon affirmed that the bat's happiness far outweighed his own selfish desires and thanked it for staying with him. Ohjin was struck by surprise, beginning to reconsider his initial impression of the place he had deemed hellish. Perhaps it was more rational than he had assumed. The dragon then turned to Ohjin and expressed his gratitude for helping him recognize his mistakes. As promised, he stated that Ohjin would receive an appropriate reward for lending his power and asked what he wished for. Ohjin instinctively replied that, in his next life, he hoped to be reborn as a wealthy Arab oil prince, leaving the dragon utterly confused. Realizing the dragon didn't understand, Ohjin changed his wish and said he wanted to reincarnate as the rich son of a famous villain, which only added to the dragon's bewilderment as he failed to comprehend anything Ohjin was saying. Ohjin, still puzzled, began to wonder about the term spirit, which the dragon kept using repeatedly. Eventually, the dragon decided to gift him a magical tool infused with divine power, explaining that it could create anything he desired. However, he warned that the tool would not function if used with malicious intent, though he was certain Ohjin had no such intentions. The dragon thanked him once more, expressing deep appreciation for the help he had provided, and wished for him to return safely. As Ohjin prepared to leave, he once again found himself confused, questioning whether this place was truly the afterlife. But then a realization struck him. He was experiencing something straight out of the fantasy comics he used to read. Growing nervous, he called out, asking the dragon to wait a moment. He shouted desperately just before being sent back, begging the dragon to grant him one final wish, to return to life. Then he hastily added that he wanted to go back to the early days of Bitcoin in particular. At that moment, the dragon was preoccupied with the idea of going to fetch some fruit for the bat. In the next instant, Ohjin suddenly found himself in a completely different place. He fell to the ground, deeply regretful for missing what he considered the chance of a lifetime, to go back to the early days of Bitcoin. His regret grew as he thought about the things he could have wished for, like a golden plot of land in a luxurious area, or stocks he had previously invested in that had risen in value. He wished he had been quick enough to think through his desires, only to realize that all he had received was a necklace. Mockingly, he wondered what he could possibly do with a necklace that carried divine power from a dragon who didn't even know how to use it. Pausing to reflect on the necklace, Ohjin sarcastically commented that perhaps the dragon had tricked him, as he hadn't explained how to use its power. Suddenly, a large man carrying barrels appeared and shouted angrily at Ohjin to get out of the way, prompting Ohjin to quickly move aside. Still dazed, he stood in place for a moment, puzzled by everything happening around him, and then heard a vendor calling out that his goods were extremely cheap, which only added to Ohjin's confusion. When he turned around, he realized he was in a bustling marketplace filled with people and merchandise, and the surroundings were clearly unlike anything from his own world. As he stood still, observing everything, a man brushed past him roughly, complaining about Ohjin standing in the middle of the road. Ohjin touched his shoulder, startled by how real everything felt, and began to question whether he had truly come back to life or if his soul had entered another body. Looking around from a higher point, he realized the place was completely unfamiliar, and he was confused, remembering that the dragon had said he would be sent home. Just then, a young fruit seller called out to him warmly, inviting him to buy some delicious fruit. He approached her and, still confused, asked about the place he had ended up in. She replied that he seemed lost due to his odd clothing and assumed he must be a traveler. The vendor explained that he was in a place called Belmore, located in the southern lands of Baron Doyle, an area not particularly known for its landmarks, but quite popular among travelers due to its abundance of inns and shops. When she asked where he had come from, Ohjin sarcastically said he was from somewhere very far away and couldn't stop himself from cursing the dragon over the misunderstanding. The vendor smiled and joked that he must be from a very remote village. Suddenly, a loud commotion erupted when a nearby fruit crate fell over, followed by the appearance of a massive rabbit-like creature that began devouring carrots with intense hunger. Information about the creature identified it as a giant rabbit named Elizabeth, known for eating excessively when stressed. Panic spread quickly through the market as people reacted to the chaos caused by the enormous rabbit. Ohjin turned to a nearby woman and, in disbelief, asked how such a creature could move freely in the city without any opposition. She told him it was Baron Belmore's pampered pet and advised him to flee immediately. Ohjin found it hard to accept that such a beast was being referred to simply as a rabbit, while the woman appeared frustrated that the day's sales had been ruined by the uproar. His concern deepened when he heard a sharp scream in the distance and turned his head anxiously. A small girl was crying out in fear, calling for her mother, while the giant rabbit, Elizabeth, loomed threateningly behind her. The rabbit opened its massive mouth, attempting to swallow the terrified child. Ohjin stood frozen in shock, questioning how something like that could be considered a mere rabbit. He then dashed toward the girl, trying desperately to save her. His confusion only grew, as he had never heard of anyone dying from a rabbit bite before. At the last moment, he managed to grab the child and pull her away from the rabbit's gaping jaws. Both he and the girl fell to the ground, and while checking on her condition, he was still trying to make sense of what was happening around him. Just as he tried to reassure himself that at least he had managed to save someone, he was stunned to see the rabbit charging at them once again. Ohjin slowly came to the sad realization that he might have doomed both himself and the little girl, and that they could very well die together at that moment. Then, pulling himself together, he told himself that it wasn't his fault, but rather the fault of the owner of the giant rabbit, who had irresponsibly let it roam freely. Suddenly, the necklace he carried began to glow and emit a strange energy. Amid his anger and muttering about the need to restrain such oversized animals, the necklace's power activated unexpectedly. The rabbit was completely caught off guard by the mysterious energy that suddenly bound it, with ropes of light appearing and wrapping tightly around its body, anchoring it in place. Ohjin stood there in shock, unable to believe what he had just witnessed, or rather, what he had just done. Everyone around him began staring in astonishment at the unfolding scene. Some onlookers started wondering whether this was magic and if Ohjin was a mage, given how easily he had managed to stop the giant rabbit. The children around him were especially awestruck, now convinced that Ohjin wasn't just an ordinary traveler but a sorcerer. Ohjin himself was deeply confused, uncertain of what was really happening or how he had been able to wield such power so suddenly. At that moment, a wealthy man appeared, rushing toward the giant rabbit, Elizabeth, and calling out to her anxiously, clearly worried for her safety. Turning to his servants in anger, he scolded them for failing to control a single rabbit and declared he would deduct from their wages as punishment. He then returned to the rabbit, speaking to it with excessive gentleness and pleading with it to walk with him again. However, when he saw that the rabbit was bound, he was struck by shock and fury, yelling to know who was responsible. His gaze landed on Ohjin, and he confronted him furiously, demanding to know what he had done to his beloved Elizabeth. Ohjin tried to apologize politely, explaining that he had been forced to restrain the creature due to the extreme danger it posed, pointing out that someone had nearly died because of it. The man became enraged, dismissing Ohjin's words and arrogantly insisting that his precious pet would never harm anyone. He ordered Ohjin to release her immediately. This pushed Ohjin into a state of seething frustration. He immediately classified the man among those pet owners he deeply disliked, the kind who always insisted their animals were harmless no matter what. Then, with biting sarcasm, Ohjin lashed out at the man, asking whether, if he was so sure of his pet's innocence, he'd be willing to stick his head inside the rabbit's mouth to prove it. The people around them were visibly impressed and thrilled by Ohjin's bold words, especially the fruit vendor and her brother, who were secretly urging him to keep going. At that point, Ohjin turned his gaze back to the rabbit, observing it closely and trying to better understand the situation. He made an effort to control his anger, reminding himself that he was a grown, educated man who needed to respond calmly. He began contemplating the type of rabbit it might be, noting from its ears that it appeared to be a lop-eared rabbit, a breed not meant to be out wandering in such crowded places. He explained to the rich man that rabbits are territorial and highly sensitive creatures, and asked whether he had noticed any aggressive behavior or signs of self-harm from the animal. The man, stunned by Ohjin's accuracy, admitted that the rabbit had recently been pulling out its fur repeatedly. Ohjin explained that such behavior was a clear sign of intense stress, warning that the rabbit might become seriously ill or even die prematurely if this continued. The man was shocked and deeply alarmed by this, asking in disbelief whether Ohjin meant that Elizabeth could die. Ohjin advised him to stop subjecting the rabbit to such strange outings. The man then asked how the rabbit would get the exercise it needed, to which Ohjin replied that it was entirely possible to provide that even indoors. He then questioned with genuine curiosity how the rabbit had even grown to such a massive size. Ohjin continued to explain gently, assuring the man that he understood his deep affection for Elizabeth, but reminded him that rabbits were extremely sensitive creatures. He added that affection alone wasn't enough. They needed proper care and a solid understanding of their needs. The man looked surprised and moved by Ohjin's words, admitting that it was clear he truly cared about rabbits. Embarrassed, Ohjin denied it, but the man went on to explain that people often mocked him for raising rabbits, claiming it was a hobby suited for noble women, and that he was genuinely happy to meet someone who appreciated rabbits as he did. The man then asked if Ohjin worked in animal care, and Ohjin responded hesitantly that he did, in a way. The man immediately ordered his servant to bring all his belongings quickly. The servant handed Ohjin a sum of money and politely asked him to accept it and to check on Elizabeth's health from time to time. The man then left with his giant rabbit and attendants, apologizing affectionately to Elizabeth and promising her rest and delicious food at home. Ohjin stood stunned, holding the money he had just received, realizing that this might not be the kind of place he'd visit often. In the next moment, people gathered around him excitedly, thanking him for finally putting an end to the giant rabbit's chaos. They rushed toward him, warmly welcoming and celebrating his actions, expressing their joy at his courage in confronting the arrogant baron. The fruit vendor approached him with a smile, thanking him and saying that, thanks to him, she could finally work in peace. She offered him a special discount on apples, but Ohjin replied awkwardly that he didn't have any money since he had just arrived in the area. She smiled and pointed to the money the baron had given him, remarking that money was the one thing the baron had in abundance. Ohjin opened the pouch in surprise to find it filled with gleaming gold coins. He bit into one to check its authenticity, and the vendor laughed, assuring him that those were indeed the standard gold coins used here. A rush of excitement stirred in Ohjin as he began thinking that if he could return to his own world with such valuable coins, universally valuable across worlds, he'd be in a remarkable position. His eyes sparkled at the sight of the gold, and he started wondering about real estate prices in the area. It suddenly struck him that this opportunity might be far better than Bitcoin, and he decided to open a second branch of his veterinary clinic in this new world. He also planned to use the profits he'd earn here to pay off the debts of his original clinic. Sometime later, Ohjin was seen sitting on a chair in what looked like an official setting, thanking a group of people for attending. The attendees appeared tense and uncertain about what was to come, while Ohjin explained that he hoped to select one of them for a certain task. Leaning forward slightly, he announced the beginning of the event, emphasizing that what was about to happen was a matter of life or death, an interview to choose staff for his animal clinic. Earlier, the baron had approached Ohjin and asked if he planned to settle down in the area. Generously, he offered him a house, money, or even land to help him get started. Thanks to the baron's generous support, the second branch of Kim Ohjin's animal clinic opened smoothly without any difficulties. Ohjin came to realize that the most important thing in life was to have strong, beneficial relationships, to the point that he found himself silently expressing sincere gratitude. "I love you." Upon learning of Ohjin's intention to settle in the area, the baron personally prepared an entire shop for him, stocked with all kinds of rabbit care supplies. While cleaning and organizing the place, Ohjin expressed mild surprise at the sheer number of grooming tools for rabbits, but quickly dismissed the thought, since it had all been provided to him for free. As he continued tidying up his new shop, Ohjin began to reflect on what remained ahead, successfully running the clinic and earning profits. However, a sense of unease crept over him due to how little he actually knew about this new world, especially concerning the dragon who had brought him here. He wondered whether he would need to find the dragon in order to return to his original world. With that in mind, he decided to search for a new employee who might be able to provide him with essential information. He hung up a job posting outlining the qualifications required to work at his clinic. Soon, the personal interviews for applicants at Kim Ohjin's animal clinic began. Seated before them, Ohjin asked the candidates to introduce themselves in order from the right. The first applicant introduced himself as Thomas, the second son of a prestigious family, claiming to be well-mannered, respectful, and physically strong. But to Ohjin, he came across as dull and lacking personality, prompting him to give Thomas an average score. Ohjin noted on the evaluation sheet that this type of person lacked individuality, and that he preferred candidates with more distinct character. The second candidate, named Philip, said his family had been working with animals for generations, which piqued Ohjin's curiosity, leading him to ask what kind of work that involved. Philip calmly smiled and explained that his family owned a butcher shop, and that he had been working with animals since childhood, mastering the art of using knives. This response deeply unsettled Ohjin. He sarcastically jotted down a note on the evaluation form recommending that the police be contacted, as he was highly disturbed by such a background. Then came the third candidate, whose appearance was so intimidating that Ohjin couldn't help but wonder whether the man had ever dismembered someone. Still, he decided not to jump to conclusions based solely on looks, and politely asked what had motivated him to apply and whether he felt nervous. But the man suddenly erupted with intense enthusiasm, declaring that he had been searching for Ohjin for a long time and begged him almost manically to let him become his shoe. After that incident, Ohjin resolved to rely on appearances when judging people from now on. The third candidate began approaching Ohjin in a strange and threatening manner, repeatedly chanting the word magic, which caused Ohjin to feel deeply anxious and fearful. Meanwhile, the fourth candidate, a woman, sat silently observing the situation. She calmly asked when her turn would come, even as the third man closed in menacingly. Ohjin cried out to her in desperation, shocked that she would ask such a question so calmly while he was under attack. At that point, the woman wondered aloud whether she should step in and handle the situation herself. She quickly sprang into action, striking the third man with incredible force and saving Ohjin from the dangerous encounter, knocking the man to the ground. The third applicant collapsed unconscious after the powerful blow, and calm was restored to the room. With composure, the fourth candidate introduced herself as Selena. She continued speaking with confidence, explaining that she was a traveling animal expert skilled in first aid treatment. Ohjin looked at her with admiration and full confidence, and without hesitation, declared her hired with a perfect score. He shook Selena's hand formally, officially welcoming her to the clinic as a technical specialist. Later, Ohjin sat in his new clinic, enjoying the warmth of the sunlight as he took in the place he had just opened. However, the comfort didn't last long. He began to feel uneasy when he noticed that Selena had not arrived for work on time. Sitting in thought, Ohjin admitted to himself that perhaps he had been too hasty in hiring Selena the day before, and started thinking about a suitable spot to hang a new job posting. Suddenly he heard a knock at the door and assumed the employee who hadn't shown up on time had finally arrived. Ohjin opened the door with a big smile, welcoming who he thought was the staff member, and gently asked whether she had eaten lunch properly. However, he was surprised to find that the person standing there was not Selena, but rather a young stranger who laughed and replied that he hadn't eaten yet, then wondered aloud whether he should eat first. Ohjin, clearly confused, asked who he was. Despite the unexpected situation, Ohjin decided to receive him politely, invited him inside to sit down, and offered him either water or tea. The young man chose tea. As Ohjin began preparing the tea, he felt a great sense of joy, thinking to himself that this was the first customer of his clinic's second branch, what he saw as the first step toward paying off his debts. He was determined to succeed this time, having carefully studied all the reasons why the first branch had failed. He recalled how, at his previous clinic, clients would often complain when he advised them to properly care for their pets, such as brushing their teeth regularly. Back then, clients would grumble about how difficult such care was. Ohjin, quick to anger at the time, would respond with sarcastic remarks about their negligence, which eventually led to negative online reviews. Those reviews had deeply affected him, and he came to regret his reactions. Reflecting on that, Ohjin resolved to keep his temper under control this time and focus on offering excellent service. He then asked the young man about the pet he had brought for treatment. The young man pulled his pet from his pocket, a small red creature named Bojack, which he described as a cute little lizard. Ohjin examined the creature closely and felt relieved that it was just a normal lizard, after having feared that all animals in this world would be bizarre, like the giant rabbit. Still, he was puzzled to see the lizard in the young man's pocket instead of in a proper cage, and carefully asked whether it was in his pocket because it had destroyed its cage. The young man replied enthusiastically that it looked cuter that way, and that carrying it in his pocket made it even more lovable. Ohjin grew extremely frustrated by the young man's careless behavior and nearly lost his temper again, but managed to restrain himself with difficulty. Trying to calm down, he asked the young man in a composed tone why he had brought the lizard to the clinic, and whether it was sick. The young man explained that Bojack wasn't exactly ill, but was very weak and sensitive to the cold. Ohjin responded calmly, noting that such sensitivity was typical for lizards. The young man went on to say, with some concern, that the lizard's tail had fallen off the moment he grabbed it. Ohjin, clearly uneasy, replied that this was normal for lizards and advised him not to hold it by the tail again. The young man kept smiling as he asked Ohjin to simply make the lizard healthier. At that moment, Ohjin recalled the ice dragon who had once come to him with a similar complaint about his pet, and realized once again that the problem always lay with the owners, not the animals themselves. Nevertheless, Ohjin decided to run a quick checkup on the lizard, as he didn't trust its owner, and asked the young man to hand it over. As Ohjin began examining the lizard's skin, he was puzzled by its condition. He eventually diagnosed it with a condition known as disectitis, which refers to improper skin shedding. The young man appeared surprised by this strange diagnosis. He warned Ohjin that Bojack was a bit aggressive since it had lived in the streets and told him to be cautious while handling it. Suddenly, the lizard's appearance changed drastically. Its eyes ignited with blazing fire, shocking and frightening Ohjin. In the next instant, the lizard launched a massive fireball straight at Ohjin, leaving him utterly stunned. Ohjin attempted to dodge the sudden attack from the creature in his hands. At the last moment, Selena burst into the room and tried to save Ohjin from the dangerous fire assault. Continuing the events, Selena looked at Ohjin with a serious expression, pointing out that he had nearly taken a direct hit from a fire salamander. She expressed her frustration, saying she almost lost her boss on her very first day at work. Ohjin was slammed against the wall from the force of the blow, visibly stunned and in pain. Still aching, he muttered sarcastically that taking the fireball might have been better than the hit he had just received. He then began examining the salamander, Bojack, the very first patient in his new clinic, and noted that he couldn't touch it directly, as it might release fire if it felt threatened. Selena asked if they had a fire-resistant suit, while the salamander's owner seemed fascinated by how beautiful his pet was. Ohjin asked him where he had gotten it from. The young man explained that he had found it on a mountain near his home, and with great enthusiasm, said he had fallen in love with it at first sight, and brought it home immediately. He then jokingly asked Selena if she was jealous of his pet, but she responded coldly, denying it. Moments later, Selena clarified that capturing salamanders in that region was illegal, as they were wild creatures and not easily kept by humans. The young man was shocked upon hearing that, and anxiously asked whether he could still keep it, admitting that he had grown very attached to Bojack. Selena firmly told him he couldn't, as it was against the law, but she tried to reassure him a little. She suggested a temporary solution, that they say they were only keeping the salamander for medical treatment and would release it back into the wild once it had recovered. However, the young man strongly rejected the idea of saying goodbye to his beloved Bojack. In a mix of sorrow and anger, he shouted that he wouldn't accept it. He suddenly bolted out of the clinic with the salamander in his arms, shouting that they should just leave him alone so he and Bojack could live together in peace. Ohjin was completely baffled by the strange behavior of the young man and wondered aloud what was wrong with him, while Selena suggested he might have simply gone home. But Ohjin burst out at her in frustration, asking how she could just stand there and watch everything unfold without doing anything to stop him, especially when treatment hadn't even begun yet. He then sternly ordered her to go after him at once. Selena, clearly nervous, agreed immediately, while the question remained, would Ohjin succeed in his very first treatment? Meanwhile, life in town had become noticeably calmer and more pleasant, especially now that the Baron's giant rabbit was no longer around. A fruit vendor remarked with a smile that life was indeed better, so long as the giant rabbit was too busy playing with the Baron to cause any more trouble. But soon, a bizarre scene unfolded before the vendor's eyes, the young man sprinting down the street with Selena and Ohjin chasing closely behind. The young man looked terrified, clutching Bojack tightly, while Selena and Ohjin raced to catch up. Ohjin, completely exhausted from the chase, could barely speak as he pleaded with the young man to stop. Watching the strange scene, the fruit vendor quietly muttered in fear that she had no idea what was going on, but she'd rather not get involved or ask. The young man, overwhelmed with fear, ran while wondering in deep sadness why they were chasing him and trying to take Bojack away. As he ran, he began to cry, holding Bojack tightly and promising that he would never let anyone separate them. Ohjin, furious and completely worn out, shouted at the top of his lungs, trying to convince the young man to stop because Bojack urgently needed to shed his skin. Eventually, Ohjin came to a stop, leaning against a wall, panting heavily, with Selena standing next to him. She commented sarcastically that he really needed to exercise a bit more. Then, shifting to a serious tone, she asked if Bojack truly hadn't shed his skin, as he claimed. Ohjin, still catching his breath, confirmed it was true, explaining that 2 or 3 layers of skin had built up and needed to be removed immediately. Selena became visibly worried upon hearing this, and firmly stated that they needed to act fast, prompting Ohjin to question why she was suddenly so alarmed. She began to explain the severity of the situation, saying that when a salamander fails to shed its skin, fire builds up inside its body. Once that fire reaches a critical level, and the salamander can no longer endure it, the result would be a dangerous explosion. Meanwhile, the young man was still running, clutching Bojack tightly, his face filled with fear, while Selena continued explaining that such an explosion could result in a devastating catastrophe. Ohjin agreed with her, clearly expressing his concern that the salamander's explosion wouldn't just harm its owner, it could destroy the entire area. Tension and anxiety were written all over Ohjin's face as he said they had to find the salamander quickly before it was too late. At that moment, the young man reached his home and locked the door behind him, feeling a bit reassured, thinking that he was finally safe and no one would catch up with him. He spoke to Bojack with relief, telling him they were now safe, and once again promised that no one would ever separate them. Overwhelmed with emotion, he decided to celebrate the moment by composing a song and began looking for a piece of paper to write the lyrics. During that time, strange signs began to appear on Bojack. His body emitted an unnatural glow, indicating that an explosion was imminent. But the young man, lost in his excitement over the song, didn't notice. He continued singing enthusiastically, pouring his feelings into lyrics about the power of love. Just then, Bojack's body ignited in a terrifying blaze, his eyes glowing with intense fire. The young man, smiling innocently, turned to him and asked how he liked the song. Suddenly, a massive explosion erupted from the fire building up inside the salamander, and a giant fireball blasted toward the young man. He was thrown to the floor by the force of the blast, writhing in pain and struggling to understand what had just happened. When he came to, the room around him was engulfed in flames, and he was overcome with panic and disbelief. He turned to Bojack, shouting in confusion, asking what had happened and whether Bojack had caused the fire. He cautiously approached the salamander, his voice filled with fear, asking why it had gotten so angry and why it had set the place ablaze. Slowly reaching out his hand, he said they had to get out quickly, as the situation had become dangerous. But Bojack responded aggressively. His fire flared up again, signaling another attack. He launched a fireball directly at the young man, who stood there in disbelief, insisting that Bojack would never hurt him because they were family. At the last second, Ohjin heroically intervened, saving the young man from the salamander's deadly attack and grabbing the creature with his bare hands, trying to restrain it. Bojack flared up in Ohjin's hands, fiercely resisting. Alarmed, Ohjin shouted to Selena, asking if the salamander's rampage meant it would now attack humans too. Selena confirmed that it had completely lost control, and if they didn't calm it down soon, it would unleash even more fire, making it absolutely necessary to stop it immediately. Ohjin, still holding the struggling creature, was deeply confused, unsure how to calm it in such a violent state. The flames surrounding Bojack grew more intense, and the situation became increasingly dangerous. At that critical moment, the magical pendant given to Ohjin by the dragon began to glow brightly, radiating with mystical energy. Suddenly, an item Ohjin had been thinking about, a fire extinguisher, appeared before him, conjured by the pendant's magic. He was stunned by what had just occurred, his face filled with astonishment. Without hesitation, he began using the fire extinguisher on the salamander, trying to put out the flames and take control of the situation. After a few bursts of the extinguisher, Bojack's appearance changed dramatically. He transformed into a small, gentle white creature, visibly confused and no longer raging. Holding the extinguisher, Ohjin was surprised and admitted that the pendant from the dragon was proving to be extremely useful. Meanwhile, the flames inside the house began to die down gradually. Selena approached the young man to reassure him that things were now somewhat under control and gently asked if he was all right. Still in shock, the young man muttered the word rampage in disbelief, struggling to grasp what had just taken place. Then, as realization dawned on him, he sadly admitted that this explained why Bojack had attacked. If he had let him shed his skin, none of this would have happened. But with a renewed sense of optimism, he said it was good that he now understood, and promised that, from now on, he would take better care of the salamander. Ohjin, watching this unexpectedly cheerful reaction, couldn't help but be surprised by the young man's simplicity. Ohjin, both angry and bewildered, asked the young man if that was really all he had to say after everything that had happened. The young man, clearly confused and flustered, didn't know how to respond. Trying to calm Ohjin, he said that his feelings toward the salamander had never changed and that they could simply rebuild the house. Ohjin exploded in frustration, raising his voice as he told him that, had the fire continued even a little longer, it could have spread to the neighboring houses and harmed others. Being safe himself wasn't enough. The young man, anxious, replied that this was why he had said he would take better care of the salamander from now on, asking if that wasn't what mattered now. Ohjin had nothing left to say. He simply placed his hand on his face and sighed in deep exasperation. Then he began explaining calmly that wild animals shouldn't be raised recklessly, as they have their own environments and natural habitats. Selena added that bringing animals home just because they're cute, without understanding their nature or needs, was a mistake, and asked if he really considered that to be love. Ohjin then asked whether the young man was confident he could control the salamander if it ever lost control again. The young man, saddened and hesitant, admitted that he couldn't. Ohjin gently but firmly explained that love and affection alone were not enough to properly care for an animal. A heavy silence fell over them as the three stood still, each lost in thought. Later, Ohjin and Selena brought the salamander back to the forest to return it to its natural environment. Ohjin remarked that Bojack looked healthier now after shedding his skin, and Selena agreed, adding that he looked good too. At that moment, the salamander revealed its true form, larger and more powerful now that it had cast off its old skin, leaving both Ohjin and Selena astonished.